Our, this is a program on constitutional government, our Friday lunchtime series, and today's speaker is James Piereson. James Piereson was formerly executive director of the Olin Foundation when he was the author of many, many good works and made funding available to important people with interesting things to say throughout universities in America, including this one. He's now a senior fellow and director at the Manhattan Institute. He's from Michigan. He went to Michigan State University, both as an undergraduate and to get his PhD in political science. And he's the author of Camelot and the Cultural Revolution, How the Assassination of John F. Kennedy Shattered American Liberalism, this in 2007. And he writes for Commentary, The New Criterion, National Interest, and other significant publications. His talk today is on John Maynard Keynes and the modern revolution in political economy. Jim.
Okay, appreciate it, Harvey. Thanks very much for hosting me. Thanks, Anna, very much for that lovely dinner last night. Thanks to Andy Zwick also for all of your help. And thank all of you. My subject today is John Maynard Keynes. I'll depart somewhat from the paper that I've written on this. This is a large subject. You might ask the question, why is someone educated in political science and interested in politics messing around with an economist like John Maynard Keynes? Let me try to answer that question. Keynes, I think, can illuminate some permanent questions of political life. What would those be? Well, one important one would be how habits and systems of politics can become so entrenched that leaders are unable to adapt them to new circumstances as they arise, which is one reason why some of these systems explode rather than being adapted preemptively to new circumstances. A second might be that Keynes can be understood as the intellectual founder of a new order of politics and economics. Why is that an idea that's not generally accepted? Perhaps one reason is that he articulated his ideas in the language of economics, and the Keynesian legacy was taken over by economists and not studied all that systematically by people who study politics. It is said that we live in the age of Keynes. Many people dispute and argue about that, but Keynes is experiencing a kind of a comeback in the current financial crisis, which is another reason to study Keynes. Keynes lived from 1883, dies in 1946. Lives in Cambridge almost his whole life, spends a lot of time in London with the Bloomsbury Group on Russell Square. He's a man of many parts, classically educated, the greatest economist of the century. If we consider that period from 1914 to 1945, as some have called it, the Second 30 Years' War, Keynes, I think, was probably the most important intellectual figure of that era. It would be hard to think of someone who surpasses Keynes in his influence. In many ways, Keynes is the author of the system of politics and economics under which we live today. America has been through three great revolutions. Professor Keller here has written about that very well. The American Revolution and the Constitutional era, the Civil War era, and the Great Depression and World War II. And Keynes was a principal intellectual figure in that third revolution. Keynes wrote two important books in his life. One, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in 1919, a commentary on the Treaty of Versailles, which I'll talk about momentarily, and the general theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, published in 1936, which was the economic tract that revolutionized the discipline of economics. It's often been questioned, what is the link between these two books? Keynes's career is somewhat reversed. Many great economists or thinkers write their deep scholarly works first and then move on to polemics and commentary on current politics. Keynes did it in the reverse way. The Economic Consequences of the Peace was a polemical attack on the Treaty of Versailles. 16 years later, he worked out the economic implications of what he'd seen in Paris. In 1942, Keynes gave a talk on the 300th anniversary of the birth of Newton. A son of Cambridge, Newton was. Keynes collected a lot of Newton's papers. And in that talk, Keynes said that Newton was not the first of the rationalists. He was the last of the magicians, the last of the sorcerers. His point was that Newton saw things long before he proved them. He saw them intuitively and instinctively, and then only later did he begin to work out the proofs to demonstrate to others. One could ask the question if perhaps this might apply to Keynes himself in his career as he moved from a polemicist actually to a great economic commentator. Well, let's begin with the Economic Consequences of the Peace, published in late 1919. Keynes, through World War I, was an employee of the Treasury Department and was sent to the Paris Peace Conference as a British representative there, and so observed the conference as it took place from January to June of 1919. He left in disgust at the treaty that was being worked out and went back to Cambridge and in a matter of 2 or 3 months wrote this book, The Economic Consequences of the Peace, which became an international bestseller and is often credited with turning opinion in America and England against the treaty. This book is written from a kind of Olympian perspective. Keynes is obviously read as Gibbon and as classical authors. It's written in a kind of a detached way, but also in a polemical style. Keynes, basically in this book, sets out a distinction between the prejudices of the politicians who negotiated the treaty at Paris and the economic requirements for the rebuilding of Europe. And in the first chapter, he outlines the characteristics of the old order in Europe, the golden age of Europe from 1870 to 1914, basically destroyed in World War I. And there are several components of that order, that old order. One was the rise of Germany, which was very much of a destabilizing presence in that period. Germany and France in 1870, of course, Germany defeats France and the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71 and forces France to pay reparations, which amounted to somewhere between 5 and 10% of the French GDP in 1871. Their populations were roughly equal in 1871. But by 1914, Germany had about 70 million people, and France had about 40 million people. And Germany had become an industrial power in Europe, producing much of its coal and iron. And therefore, Germany is a tremendous threat to France. That was one destabilizing factor. Keynes was also a kind of a Malthusian, constantly talking about the pressures population were placing on politics and production. His great fear was that civilization would collapse as the capitalist system could no longer produce the kinds of things needed to sustain these growing populations. he also points out the dependence of the European order on the New World, that is America, because in this period, Europe is importing foodstuffs from America, and those prices in the decade or so before the war are starting to escalate and expand in relation to European prices, putting pressure on the European economies. And in this period, the United States is accumulating a vast percentage of the gold in the world. Of course, they're operating on a gold standard. And he said there was a delicate psychology of society, which is that the working classes would labor and be paid minimal amounts, but only on the condition that the upper classes that accumulated all this money didn't spend it, that they reinvested it in factories and railroads. So in a sense, the rich could have their cake as long as they didn't eat it. And this was, as Keynes argued, a kind of relic of Puritanism. Consumption on a vast scale was seen to be inappropriate by the wealthy classes of that period. This was as the labor unions had not yet begun to organize in this period. They were just beginning. And Keynes also sees this as a disturbance in the old order. Now, of course, he might have also spoken about the gold standard in that period, and that's related to the psychological balance between the upper classes and the lower classes, because the gold standard operated so that domestic policy was organized to maintain the exchange value of the currency rather than to maintain employment domestically. And that system then broke down in the 20s and the 30s. And one of the aspects of the Keynesian revolution is that from the 1930s forward, economic policy has been framed not so much to maintain the exchange value of the currency, but to promote domestic employment and growth. Germany, after Germany's surrender in the autumn of 1918, the victorious powers organized the peace conference in Paris, presided over by Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, and Woodrow Wilson and David Lloyd George of Great Britain are the other two major figures. Orlando of Italy is also in this group. But the first three are the main figures. And after Keynes has gone through a description of the old order of Europe, which was a golden age of Europe, and the features that are beginning to undermine it, he then goes to and discusses the peace conference and discusses why the peace conference failed. And he places most of the blame on Woodrow Wilson, probably unfairly. But he has in this chapter some devastating portraits of these figures. He admires Clemenceau because Clemenceau pushed forward a settlement that was very harsh toward the Germans. But he did so because he understood this to be in the interest of France. He says, in describing Clemenceau, he says, according to his vision of the future, European history is to be a perpetual prize fight, of which France has won this round, but of which this round is certainly not the last. From the belief that essentially the old order does not change, being based on human nature, which is always the same, and from a consequent skepticism of all that class of doctrine which the League of Nations stands for, the policy of France and Clemenceau followed logically. For a piece of magnanimity or of fair and equal treatment based on such ideology as Wilson's 14 points could only have the effect of shortening the interval of Germany's recovery and hastening the day when she will once again hurl at France her greater numbers and her superior resources and technical skill. So his aim was somewhat to dismember Germany. As Keynes goes on to describe it, he says, so far as possible, it was the policy of France to set the clock back and to undo what since 1870 the progress of Germany had accomplished. by loss of territory and other measures, her population was to be curtailed, but chiefly the economic system upon which she depended for her new strength, the vast fabric built upon iron, coal, and transport, must be destroyed. If France could seize even in part what Germany was compelled to drop, the inequality of strength between the two rivals might be remedied for many generations. So that was the French goal. Keynes's critique of this was that it's not possible to take the European system back to 1870. As he says, it would put such strains in the system, generate such misery in Europe, that it would generate the kind of revolution that had already occurred in Russia. For this failure, he blames Wilson. And as he points out, Wilson arrived in Paris in December of 1918 like a conquering hero. And people looked to him to craft a peace based on his 14 points. The 14 points basically meant that it would not be a punitive peace settlement, that it would be based upon free trade, democracy, open borders, and some effort to repair the damage that had been done to Europe during the war. But as he goes through it, he says that Wilson was really not capable of negotiating against the French and the British. Let me just read what he says here. He says, "It was commonly believed at the commencement of the conference that the President had thought out, with the aid of a large body of advisors, a comprehensive scheme not only for the League of Nations, but for the embodiment of the 14 points in a treaty of peace. But in fact, Wilson had thought out nothing. When it came to practice, his ideas were nebulous and incomplete. He had no plan, no scheme, no constructive ideas whatever for clothing the flesh of life the commandments which he had thundered from the White House. He could have preached a sermon on any one of them, or have addressed a stately prayer by the Almighty for their fulfillment, but he could not frame their concrete application to the actual state of Europe." You know, one problem was, what does self-determination mean? Who are we referring to? What peoples are we referring to when we talk about self-determination? He says that Wilson was not only ill-informed, that was true of Lloyd George as well, but his mind was slow and unadaptable. The President's slowness amongst the Europeans was noteworthy. He makes the point that the Europeans were gifted in negotiations and council and parliament and in the give and take of politics. American presidents often are not. They don't have that give and take that the Europeans had, and therefore they're not skilled in negotiations. So the Europeans were always several steps in front of Wilson. And what they did, according to Keynes, is that they bamboozled, he uses that term, Wilson, into thinking that this very punitive treaty that they negotiated was consistent with his doctrines of self-determination. Now, in Wilson's defense, Wilson had the idea that if he could just get the League of Nations approved, that later on some of these things could be negotiated in the context of a league and somewhat softened. So his main aim was to get the League. Clemenceau thought the League was pointless, so was happy to give that to Wilson in exchange for a treaty that would dismember Germany. So a key theme here is a failure of Wilson, and I think historians who've gone back and looked at this, economists, there's a general agreement that one of the great problems in the interwar period was that the United States did not take leadership of the Western world after the war, after the Europeans were no longer capable of playing that role. The United States, of course, rejected the treaty and kind of retreated into isolation in the 1920s. Well, the treaty dismembered Germany in many ways. The Saar and the Ruhr Valley, where coal and iron production were prominent, was placed under a League of Nations mandate. They had to give up their navy. All their shipping was given over to the Allied powers. Railroad cars, locomotives, coal mines given over to the Allies. In other words, the basis of German prosperity and the things that they would export to earn the foreign currency to pay reparations was more or less taken from them. German colonies abroad were seized, and the assets of German citizens abroad were likewise seized by the Reparations Committee. And Germany was required to pay about $5 billion immediately in reparations to the Allies. That was about 25% of German GDP in 1920, a significant sum. So obviously Germany was shocked by this outcome, which seemed to be so much at variance with Wilson's 14 points, which was the basis on which they surrendered. Keynes said this will never work. Germany can't pay these reparations. They won't pay them. In time, you won't be able to force them to pay. He arrived at a figure that Germany could pay that was much lower than what the Reparations Committee ultimately came up with. The committee, the conference turned this over to a committee and asked them to come up with a figure for reparations. They came up with a figure of $65 billion in 1920 prices that Germany had to pay over 30 years. German GDP in 1920 was about $20 billion. So that $65 billion is about 3 times German GDP in 1920. It's a very large number. Through the 1920s, of course, this was reduced. And in the mid-1920s, the Germans were only paying annually a small fraction of that number that was arrived at in 1921. So when people say that it was the reparations that led to the rise of Hitler, to some extent that's exaggerated because those reparations were negotiated downward through the 1920s. But Keynes, as a consequence of this, predicted that this would be a disaster for European civilization in the 1920s. And to some extent it was. The League was formed. The United States rejected it. And Germany, in an attempt to pay these reparations, issued currency to purchase foreign currency with which they would pay the reparations. This generated a monstrous inflation in Germany in 1922 and 1923. It's sometimes called the second worst inflation in history. The worst inflation in history was the Hungarian pengo after World War II, I think. In 1920, prior to the war in 1913, a German mark was worth, I think there were about 4 marks to the American dollar. At the end of the war, it was 100 marks to the American dollar. By the time this inflation ended, it was 5 billion marks to the American dollar. So this went on in 1922 and 1923. So until they issued a new currency back at something close to the pre-war rates and stabilized their economy until the Depression hit. Now, as far as the conclusions Keynes draws from this whole episode was, one, the politicians have a tendency to blunder and make things worse because they are addicted to old ways of doing things. Keynes concluded that the war had opened up a gap in Western civilization and there was no way to restore the old order. A new order had to be built on entirely new foundations. All the old verities were destroyed by the war. The gold standard was gone. Victorian values had been compromised. The idea that capitalism was a stable order had been wrecked by the war. The ideas about automatic progress had also been compromised by the war. So Keynes concluded from this then that European civilization operated on the basis of a very thin veneer and was subject to collapse at any time. So Keynes emerges from this as a very prominent figure. Later on, people would blame Keynes for the fact that the treaty had been discredited. Books were written blaming actually Keynes for the rise of Hitler, because in Germany, Keynes's arguments about the injustice of the treaty were widely circulated. You know, that is obviously unfair. Hitler didn't need Keynes to come up with these arguments. Besides which, Keynes was largely right in his analysis of how this was likely to work out. In the interwar period, Keynes continued to do a great deal of writing about capitalism and about what the war really meant to the evolution of the capitalist system. He argued that the old system of free markets had also, it was also being rendered obsolete by the rise of large institutions, by what he called institutional capitalism. And he said that no longer was it necessarily the case that corporations pursued profit as their major end. They had other goals in mind. They had stability. They had reputation in mind. They wanted to control their markets. Control over these enterprises has now been passed, he said, from the entrepreneurs who built them to the managers who are running them. Many of you will be familiar with the argument that Burley and Means made in 1938 or 39 about the separation of ownership and management in the American corporation. This really originates with Keynes' writings of the 1920s. Much of the writings that John Kenneth Galbraith does in the 1950s is pretty much taken from Keynes and applied to the American situation. The New Industrial State that he wrote in 1967, I think, would be an example of his application of Keynes' ideas to the American context. Keynes also argued that socialism is as obsolete as the old order of Europe that had been destroyed by the war. He said that things were being socialized already without the need for any revolution or public ownership, because he says that these new organizations are kind of pursuing the public interest. Anyway, there's no need really to socialize them. Production was being socialized by the modern corporation. This was somewhat Keynes's conception of the modern state. His idea of the modern state was not just government. It was all the institutions that associated themselves with government to pursue a public purpose. Universities, scientific societies, large corporations, monopolies. He regarded all these as part of a system of government. So the Keynesian state was not the liberal state of old, which had a very limited purpose. The Keynesian state was a fairly broad thing that encompassed many institutions that we'd consider to be private. And Keynes no longer looked at the political system as one of a clash between a private sector and a government. These were the assumptions around which the liberal order was established in the 18th and 19th century, that there'd be this constant friction between a private society and the government, and it was necessary to keep the one small to protect the rights of individuals in the private society. Keynes also argued that this was obsolete. In other words, Keynes argued that the liberal system created by our founding fathers in the 18th century and elaborated in the 19th century is now obsolete in a modern system of capitalism. And this is another way of saying that Keynes felt that a new order had to be built that went beyond the assumptions of the 18th and 19th century. The arrival of the Great Depression then finishes off the kind of argument that Keynes was moving toward when he wrote The Economic Consequences of the Peace. In other words, that the old order was dying and a new one had to be built. Because as he would go on to write in the General Theory in 1936, the old order was based on the idea that the economy would recover more or less automatically from shocks. What would be a shock? A war is a shock. A famine is a shock. The bursting of a bubble in real estate or stocks would be a shock. This happened repeatedly through the 19th century. The United States had a significant recession every few years in the 19th century, and a whole series of banking panics, and the economies recovered very quickly. But this didn't happen in the midst of the Great Depression. It kind of went on and on. And that will then turn out to be a central idea of the Keynesian system, which is that there is no automatic process by which a market system recovers from a significant shock. Let me just backtrack just for a second, because I had this handout where I outlined these are the debts between the Allied powers that were owed in 1920. And most of them owed to the United States, as you can see. Some of them are owed to England. France was indebted both to England by about $3 billion and to the United States by $4 billion. Britain owed about $5 billion to the United States. Other countries owed money both to France and to England. Keynes's idea at the end of World War I was that really what should happen is that the United States should forgive all these war debts that were owed to the United States by France and England and the other countries. In return for that, France and England would not require Germany to pay these oppressive reparations, because the idea was that France and England needed the reparations from Germany to pay the war debts to the United States. But if the United States forgave those war debts, then of course it wouldn't be necessary to demand these reparations from Germany. And that idea was floated at the conference. And you can see these debts are pretty significant. The United States is owed, I think, around $12 or $13 billion by the different powers. U.S. GDP is around $70 billion in 1920, so that's 20% of American GDP in 1920. So these are significant debts. In the event the United States rejected that overture, they insisted that the war debts be paid by the Allied powers. And so from that standpoint, it was felt by the European powers that they needed to charge Germany. Eventually what happened was that the United States loaned Germany money to pay the reparations. And they then paid France and England and the other powers. When the U.S. stock market crashed, those loans dried up. So Germany couldn't pay its reparations, and therefore the European powers couldn't pay the United States. So there was a circular system. If one looked for a cause of the Great Depression, many people have pointed to the interest rate policy of the Federal Reserve Board, the Smoot-Hawley tariff that was passed in 1930 that depressed foreign trade, an interest rate hike in the United States in 1931 in order to protect the dollar from French speculators. All these things contributed, but this overhang of international debt was a great factor in the instability of both political and economic and financial during the 1920s, and was a factor in bringing on the Great Depression. A great problem there was that during the era of the gold standard, from the 1870s to the World War I, the European powers acted more or less in concert to coordinate their economic policies. If one country became indebted because their imports exceeded their exports by too much, the Bank of England would loan them the money to get through. In the 1920s, there is no power to take on that role. And so a kind of a beggar thy neighbor policy began to develop among the great powers. The United States passed a very heavy tariff in 1930. European countries retaliated. That tended to drag international trade downward. French speculators, as I said, attacked the British pound. They went off the gold standard. They then attacked the American dollar, forcing the American financial authorities to defend the dollar. All these things tended to ratchet the Depression downward in the 1930s. Eventually, Keynes does come up with this grand theory, which he publishes in 1936, the general theory, which in its first several chapters attacks all the presuppositions of what he calls classical economics of the 19th century. Those would be that markets adjust more or less automatically to shocks. He attacked that idea. He also attacked the idea that, that there should never be any involuntary unemployment, because the idea was in an adjusting system, wages should come down to a point where people will accept the wages and go back to work. So there might be a temporary dislocation, but there should be no long-run unemployment. And Keynes spent a great deal of time explaining why this is so. One of the reasons was the existence of labor unions, by which workers organized and kept employers from cutting wages. Keynes eventually comes down, let me just summarize this, with this idea that state spending can stabilize an economy on a more or less permanent basis, because according to his argument, the business cycle turns downward because there's inadequate demand by consumers. When investors see that, they pull back on investment, and that tends to lead to a downward cycle. And as people see this, they begin to save. And as he argued, that tends to move the cycle downward. As people save and withhold their money from the economy, that reduces the expectations that investors have that they can invest and produce and get a return. Incomes go down as a consequence of that. And so therefore, in a periods of recession or depression, saving is counterproductive. People should spend. This was his attack on, this is a so-called paradox of thrift, that savings behavior, which is logical for the individual in that circumstance, is bad for the collective because it tends to run the economy downward. All of this was somewhat part of Keynes's general attack on the 19th century system. Now, he had no mechanism by which the state would now spend this money. He did talk to Roosevelt a great deal during the New Deal, and he argued that Roosevelt was actually implementing some of his ideas through his public works programs and the deficits that the United States was running. But this was done prior to the writing of Keynes's general theory in 1936, so it was not, in a way, systematic. Once Keynes, and indeed, many people had argued that public works spending should be made by the state in times of economic downturns. People have been recommending this for a generation. It was in the platforms of many of the political parties. What Keynes does is provide this with a systematic economic argument. Keynes, in other words, did not really connect this idea of state spending to stabilize the economy to anything that the state might spend this money on. This was solved somewhat for Keynes in the 1940s by the publication of the so-called Beveridge Report, which outlined the rudiments of the welfare state in England, the National Health Service, old age pensions, and unemployment insurance, and disability are incorporated in the Beveridge Report. And Keynes instantly sees that this will provide the foundation for ongoing public spending that can be used to stabilize modern capitalist economies. At this time, in the 1930s, the U.S. government is spending only 3, 4, 5% of GDP. State and local governments are spending another 10%. So governments are very small in the United States at this time. Also in Europe, this is before the war. So the capacity of governments to spend at this time is not really large enough to implement a Keynesian policy of government spending to stabilize economies. This only happens really after World War II, when the welfare states are enacted, first in England, and then the United States has a more or less permanent military budget. So today our federal government spends somewhere between 20 and 25% of GDP annually, and state and local governments at around 15%. So we're talking about governments taking about 40% of GDP today in America compared to 10 or 15% in the 1930s. That's a significant change. So that's another contribution that Keynes makes. A final kind of contribution occurs at the end of World War II, where during the war, American and British planners are trying to devise the outlines of the post-war trading system. And Keynes is the chief British negotiator with Harry Dexter White on the American side. Harry Dexter White, the American Treasury official who was negotiating the post-war international economic institutions, was later accused of being a communist. And I think it was proven that he circulated Treasury documents to the Soviet Union during this period. Now, these were not really state secrets. These were basically plans that the Treasury had for these post-war institutions. And Harry Dexter White, who was, as I say, Keynes's other party, died within days of these accusations being made. This is not till 1948, however. So Keynes is instrumental in the Bretton Woods institutions, those being the IMF, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. So as they look back on the 30s, they see that really one of the reasons that the Depression occurred was that there was tremendous instability in exchange rates among the great powers. There was no one to coordinate those exchange rates, and as a consequence, trade among the great powers suffered in the 30s, and that was a factor in the downward spiral. So if some way could be found to stabilize exchange rates and build institutions that facilitated trade among the great powers, this would be a boon for the post-war economy. Keynes had an idea that you could create an international bank with an international currency that he called the Bancor that would be used to settle international debts. This was rejected by the United States, which favored a dollar system, with the dollar being a kind of international reserve currency that would be used to settle international accounts. Keynes, to some extent, was trying to preserve the British colonial system in the post-war period against American efforts really to dismantle it. According to the Lend-Lease provisions, when the United States loaned or sold Britain war supplies before the United States was in the war, Britain pledged in the post-war period to create a system in which there is no discrimination in foreign trade. Britain wanted to maintain a favorable system in its own colonies where it had favorable trade relations. And that codicil in the Lend-Lease agreements tended to undermine it. So when the post-war system was set up, the IMF prohibited those discriminatory systems between Great Britain and its colonies, and was one of the factors that led to the dismantling of the British colonial system in the post-war period. But the key thing is, though, that Keynes was very much involved in the settlement. And as we know, the settlement after World War II was much different from the one that was arrived at after World War I. There are no reparations, at least paid to the West. I think Germany did pay reparations to Poland. They did set up a United Nations. They did set up a system of international trade. And they did integrate the losers into the post-war system. There is no effort to dismember or isolate the losing parties, namely Japan and Germany, in the post-war system. There was a tremendous effort made actually to integrate Germany into the West. And then this was facilitated by a large American loan after the war in the form of the Marshall Plan. So after World War II, the Western powers basically did everything to create a post-war settlement that they did not do after World War I. Keynes died in 1946. His ideas spread out after the war, more or less took over the American economics profession in the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1950s, the Republican administration in the United States did not really follow Keynes's ideas. The Kennedy-Johnson administration in the 1960s was really the first effort by an American government to implement a Keynesian policy whereby fiscal policy would be used to stimulate growth in the economy. And of course, they did that with the Kennedy tax cut of 1963 and 1964. In England, Keynes's views were rejected in the 30s, but in the 40s and 1950s with the Labour government, they somewhat came into their own as the British applied this idea of using tax and spending power to promote economic growth. I think there's a question today, to circle back to where I started, which is that Keynes was the author, as I suggested, of a large revolution in the way we think about politics and the economy. It was a kind of revolt against the 19th century, stimulated by World War I and the Great Depression, and brought home by the results of World War II. Well, we've now been 65 or 70 years into this system. I think despite all the debates about free markets versus state intervention, monetarism versus Keynesianism, I think the Keynesian system is still very much in place. I think we see it today in the policies followed by the major governments, certainly the United States. Some people argue that the Reagan Revolution reversed that. I really doubt that. It's hard to think of any major program that the Reagan Revolution killed. He did slow down domestic spending, but transferred it to defense spending. Basically, I think one could argue that the renewal that occurred in the 1980s allowed for a continuation of the system that we set up in the 1930s and 40s. I think a question that might be raised now is this system that was set up in the 30s and 40s on the verge of running its course? Is it nearing, or have we followed it to a point where we're not going to be able to build on it anymore? Now, of course, what I'm talking about is the accumulation of public debt. One of the aspects of the Keynesian system, of course, is that in America, we built a whole system of institutions based on the idea that we'd like to prevent exactly this kind of operation coming into being. The Founding Fathers kind of wanted to limit the size of the federal government and its reach out into the society. And Keynes's system was designed somewhat to overcome that. a fundamental axiom, I think, of the Keynesian system is that national governments are now responsible for economic growth and for the material well-being of their citizens. That really wasn't true in the 19th century, but it's certainly been true in this era since the Great Depression. And Keynes's theories gave national governments a means of delivering that kind of growth. But is it coming to an end? I don't have an answer to that question. These previous systems that I discussed tended to last 60 or 70 years before things began to develop to break them apart. Obviously, we've accumulated very large levels of debt in Western countries. Can we continue to do that, and for how long? Certainly, the Keynesian system, I believe, will work in the short run. If we have an economic downturn, government spending can at least smooth that out to some degree. And as we've seen in this crisis, the power of central banks is enormous. Maybe more, perhaps they're more powerful than is the influence of fiscal policy. But okay, so the United States now has accumulated about $16 trillion in debt. That's equal to our GDP. How long can we continue to borrow $1 trillion a year to stabilize our economy? I think the thought is that the economy will naturally recover and we'll be able to reduce that and we'll get through this situation. But we have the baby boomers retiring. There are 80 million baby boomers born between 1946 and 1963. They just began to retire last year, reaching age 65. We have about 45 million people now on Medicare and Social Security, age 65 and over. We have 80 million people lined up to join them. So we could have a situation in 10 years after most of these people are retired where we have 80, 90 million people on Medicare and Social Security. That would be a very large number. That would be more than a third, about a third of our population of over 300 million. We have a workforce right now of about 160 million people. 16 million people are unemployed. Some of those people have part-time jobs. The workforce, because of the demographics, is growing very slowly at less than 1% a year. But we're adding 3 or 4% of our population every year to old age programs. So, you know, we could have a situation in a few years where we might have 150 million people working, paying taxes. We have 80 million people drawing old age benefits of one kind or another. How is that going to be supported? Well, either the benefits will have to be cut or we're going to have to tax young people more than is really fair to do. Now, it would be possible to get through this if we said, okay, we're going to face this very difficult situation. We're going to borrow our way through it, and when we get to the other side, we can repay that debt. The only problem is that we've already borrowed ourselves to the hilt. So that route, that option may not be available to us as this situation develops. Now, people compare our situation to World War II. At the end of World War II, we had debts that equaled our GDP, pretty much, and we paid it off in the 1950s and 1960s. But a war is different. We know that a war is going to end, and we're going to demobilize. This is the kind of thing that doesn't necessarily end. This is going to go on and on for a long period of time. Now, we can get out of it possibly by economic growth. And if we could get 4% real growth every year, that would be very helpful. It still wouldn't solve the problem. It would be very helpful. However, growth in America and in the West in general has been slowing down decade by decade since the 1950s. Average annual GDP growth in the 1950s was in excess of 5%. That continued into the 1960s. In the 1970s, it was below 4%. In the 1980s, annual growth was around 3.5%. It declined a little bit in the 1990s. And in the 2000s, even before we had the collapse in 2008, GDP growth is only around 2%. and then we went off a cliff in 2008, and we've been growing at a 1 or 2% clip since then. So that's a significant period of time. We've gone 12 years now with very subpar growth in our economies, just at the time that we're about to see an explosion in demand for government services. So that leads then to this rumination that the era during which we can try to stabilize our economies with welfare and governmental spending is going to reach a point of crisis where we're going to have to do something about it. What that is, we don't know. When I discussed World War I, Keynes's analysis of the problems of World War I was that the statesmen of that era were locked in an old period. They didn't realize that World War I had totally transformed their situation. And they're acting as if they could restore the old order in Europe, and Keynes argued this is impossible. And Keynes was largely right. Is there a sense in which our statesmen are continuing on a system of policy that is increasingly being threatened by demographics and economics? I have a hunch that that this is the case. They're now discussing in Washington some sort of a budget solution to avoid this, what they call the fiscal cliff. I would guess, if that's right, that they basically won't do much at all. All those spending cuts they're talking about will be taken off the table. The tax increases that they're talking about will be very small and marginal, and that not much at all will be done. And why is that? Well, because it's easier to continue on the path that we've been on. We can continue to borrow money at low rates. Why should we engage all this pain when we can continue to do what we've been doing? And that's perfectly understandable. But the only problem is that when these systems come apart, nobody gives you any warning. So that if there's a revolution in the Middle East, for example, oil prices go up, it causes a recession, or other countries change their policies and decide they don't want to borrow or loan as much money to the United States, that will begin to create a crisis in the United States, and it will be unannounced. So we have a situation that you can only fix a situation by acting preemptively, but the political situation is such that political leaders are not inclined to act preemptively, but will only act when they have no other choice. That is kind of the thought with which I end this paper. Now, I remark at the end of this paper on Manker Olson's criticism of Keynes, where he argues that developed systems where the political process is taken over by interest groups, as time passes, they tend to grow more slowly because all these interest groups develop a claim on government budgets and on the resources of the society, and they're not very productive. And that tends to slow down growth. So that societies that can somehow clean out all the interest groups can grow very rapidly. Germany and Japan grew very rapidly after World War II. The United States grew very rapidly after the Civil War, after those clusters of opposition to the industrial system were cleaned out by the war. He suggests that a system in which the government claims large share of the resources of the society, a Keynesian system, is vulnerable to slow growth because those resources are captured by groups that have little interest in economic growth. Whether or not that's true is difficult to assess. Nonetheless, it's my sense that we are moving into a crisis of this system that, if the past is any guide, will yield a political upheaval of the kind that we saw here in the 1930s, maybe saw in the United States in the 1850s. Okay.
Thank you, Jim. Any questions? Any possible questions to this? Yeah, Harvey.
For those of us who are laymen with regard to economics,
I'm a layman.
Keynes is always cited as the philosophical justification for deficit spending. As a matter of the record, did he ever advocate that if you run up a deficit, there was a time when you should pay it back? And the second part is, if he were advising today, when he suggested deficit financing, the debts of governments were very low, at 16 trillion, for example, for the United States, would he still advocate that there should be deficit spending as a means for the government controlling the growth and stability of the economy?
That's always a hard question to answer. Let me just backtrack. Of course, Keynes argued in the general theory that the governments could balance their accounts over the business cycle, so they could run deficits, as you suggest, on the downside of the cycle, and as the economy was stabilized, they could then repay that, so they would not run up huge debts.
And they were supposed to repay that. Is that what you thought?
Well, I think Keynes was somewhat conservative on this point. He didn't think it was good that governments ran up huge debts. This is one of the problems of the interwar period, that all these governments were destabilized by the debts they had to pay. And you're right, government budgets in the 30s, when he wrote this, were relatively small. I think it was implied in the Keynesian system, though, that governments had to become larger in order to accumulate leverage over the economy through the deficit that they might run. The post-war economists argued that, yes, Keynes offers a way to stabilize economies in recession by using government spending to spur demand and smooth that out, but if they can intervene to correct a recession, why can't they intervene and keep it from happening in the first place? So why don't we tailor our fiscal policy so that we're constantly maintaining a reasonable level of employment, and we can defeat the business cycle altogether? That was an idea that post-war Keynesians developed and was implemented during the Kennedy years. It's not clear that that worked very well in the 1970s when we had a combination of stagnation and unemployment. But what Keynes offered was a different way to look at stabilizing the economy. Up until this time, really the only thing that policymakers could do was to, one, impose tariffs to protect their industries, which they did, or two, devalue their currencies so that they could export more. That was about it. There was the idea of public works, and this is one of the things that made the Depression so difficult, because all the countries were doing these things, protecting their trade or devaluing their currencies or attacking currencies. So fiscal policy offered policymakers an entirely new tool. The only difficulty with it is that, as we know, as Manker Olson argued, every line in the government budget is surrounded by an interest group that thinks it's vital to civilization for it to be maintained. So it's not really possible for policymakers to adjust fiscal policy in the way that central bankers adjust interest rates. The politics are too difficult. As a consequence of which, the political leaders that we have today have never experienced a time when they had to cut a budget. It's never happened. They don't even know how to contemplate such an idea. And that's one of the, in fact, when they talk about cutting budgets, they mean cutting it from a baseline of increases that they've already calculated. So if you calculate that over 10 years, the budget's going to increase by 10 or 15%, and you now only increase it by 8%, you've cut it by 7%. That's the logic of the situation. So it's difficult to know what Keynes really would have thought. I don't think he didn't think that you could borrow this money as a permanent thing. He saw it as a stabilization mechanism. But you know, once Keynesianism was attached to the welfare state, once you get Keynes and the theory of deficit spending to stabilize, and you now get the Beveridge report, where we have these large claims on government for pensions and so on, these two things kind of jive and go together. We now have we have a large government, we have a permanent source of spending, but the only difficulty is that the system is so rigid politically that you can't adjust the budgets in the way that Keynes might have suggested. So Keynes, in fact, was kind of a fiscally conservative guy. He was more radical from a kind of social or intellectual point of view than he was from an economic point of view. He didn't believe in reckless spending. When the British designed their welfare state, he wanted revenues targeted to pay for them. That is, like we have in our Social Security system, where people pay in, and then the budgets are based upon those payments. So what would Keynes think today? You know, that's a very hard question. It's a little bit like asking what would Marx have thought of the Soviet Revolution and that sort of thing. It's one of these things where Keynes ignited a revolution, and he was no longer around to supervise it. It's a little bit like John Dewey and his revolution in education, perhaps not unlike Marx as well. Yeah.
So when we look back at Keynes' essay on economic possibilities for his grandchildren, he's much more optimistic about where we're going to be today than where we end up. And I think clearly one part of the picture is misunderstanding the nature of interest groups and the way political power and economic power interact. It's interesting that when you compare that with Schumpeter, I mean, Schumpeter sees some of the similar processes, but one of the antidotes to interest groups and rent-seeking is technological progress. So you'll have, you know, the old Ma bells used to be a dominant force, now cell phones replace that, et cetera. And I know people like Tyler Cowen and Peter Thiel have talked a lot about technological stagnation and how that also really deflates our possibilities for growth. And that plays into problems of rent-seeking as well. Are you optimistic on the technology side? I know it's a hotly debated question. Is that what you think is primarily responsible on top of rent-seeking, these decreasing GDP rates? Do you think there's also, if there is a problem, any low-hanging fruit on how you might reform that?
Well, I read Tyler Cowen's book and wrote about it. At that point, I hadn't thought about it enough, and I criticized his book. But as I kind of go through this subject, I think there's a lot to it. Tyler Cowen, who is a financial columnist for the New York Times and is a professor at George Mason University, wrote a short book a year or two ago in which he said the source of our slow growth since the 1970s is a slowdown in innovation. He said that growth through the 20th century was promoted by these breakthrough innovations. Electricity would be one, and the automobile would be another one, and then blowing out from all this are all these applications and all these jobs and changing the standard of living and so on, which propelled America and the West through the 20th century. And he argues, and other people have argued, that slowed down, and that's a source of our slow growth. Now, the first thing I thought of when I read that book was computers and cell phones. But he argues there's not much to that, because they don't create, they're productivity saving, but they don't seem to create many jobs. I think he said that Facebook, which was worth, I don't know what it's worth, $100 billion or a lot less now, right? Only employed about 10,000 people. The auto industry employed, I forget what it employed in its heyday in the 1950s, probably a few million workers. I think GM had 700,000 workers in the 1950s. Here's a company the size of GM at that time, which only has 10 or 15,000 workers. The same with Google and Yahoo and all the rest. These are very efficient enterprise is worth a lot of money, but they don't employ a lot of people. So yeah, I'm kind of.
Oh, what about fracking?
Yes. No, I think that's very good. Yes, that's a possibility. The whole explosion in natural gas and oil shale. I think that's something that might help us out if we don't kill that. I don't think it's going to be green energy, which some people thought a few years ago was going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen. So yes, I think for an economy like ours to continue to generate growth, we need continued innovation. And nobody can snap their fingers and produce it. No one, all these great innovations that we talk about, no one anticipated them, a few years before they happened. No one anticipated electricity. No one in 1890 really anticipated what the automobile would do. But if you look at just a couple of these industries, like the automobile, all these governments now have to pave all these roads, and they have to build bridges. And there's a rubber industry and a steel industry and all that. All sorts of things are associated with it, an insurance industry, a medical industry to clean up after all the accidents and so on. So that was a far-reaching innovation in American life. And, it still hasn't been completed because we're still building highways and bridges and so on. So the railroad, people didn't anticipate that either in the early 1900s. And that played a great role in building up the industrial system. So, yeah, that might be the case. That might be a source of our slowdown. Yeah, maybe you're right, the fracking, or maybe somebody will invent something. It's in the nature of things that we can't anticipate, otherwise we'd have invented it. Yeah, anybody else? Yeah, Martin?
Just along the same lines, I agree, it's very hard to see any significant or visible prospects for substantial growth in the United States, particularly given the aging of the population. But if you look at it worldwide, this is a time of enormous growth. I mean, China and India began it, and it's now seeming to happen in Africa, and very closely related to not only to the traditional forms of increased production, but to the new technology as well. Now, what do you think would be the consequences of a continuation of this, i.e. a 20th century England-like lag in the United States and 19th century US growth-like growth in the rest of the world?
Well, it's possible. You mentioned the demographics. One of the reasons that the United States may have grown so, not so greatly, but reasonably well in the 80s and 90s, was that baby boom generation was at the peak period of their earning power. They're in their 40s and 50s. Now that generation has now moved on into their 60s, and their productivity is slowing down. So demographically, the country is aging. That cohort in the middle is smaller than it's been. So that would portend slower growth in America, I would think. So your thought is that in this period ahead, the United States may emulate Britain, and China may take the place of the United States of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Well, assuming that, what conceivable role is there for the United States to improve its situation in such a world?
Yeah. Well, look, the United States is blessed with tremendous natural resources, minerals, oil, so on. We could be, if we wanted to, close to being self-sustaining on those fronts. We may get there. A highly educated population, 320 million people. Somewhat safe from the rest of the world, protected by oceans and so on. The United States has, I would say, great potential for growth. we may go through a 20-year period of slowdown that will compromise our welfare state before we come out of it on the other side. One thing I would fear is this. You know, if you've written about these revolutions that we've had in the past, one of the things that's happened in all these revolutions, Jefferson's revolution in 1800, the Civil War revolution, and the New Deal revolution, is that in each of these cases, one of the parties developed overwhelming power. Jefferson's party basically wiped out the Federalists. They won 6 straight presidential elections from 1800 to 1824. When the South seceded, the Republicans basically were able, on a one-party basis, to run the American system. They also won 5 straight presidential elections between 1860 and 1880, and they ran the Congress, and they could impose this revolution. The same thing happened after 1930 and 1932. By 1936, I think there were only 16 Republican senators. The Republican Party was basically wiped out in the 30s, and therefore Roosevelt could push through his New Deal reforms. Now, what's going to happen now? I think that we could have perpetual stalemate in the American system. I'm not sure that I see any of these parties breaking through and imposing a kind of change on the system. Now, you know, we could have an unforeseen collapse, which would generate that. But these parties are very polarized now, as you know, and they've staked out bases of support in different parts of the country, and they don't seem to have a mind toward negotiating these differences very well. So we could have a more difficult problem because we have a stalemate in the political system. That's one thing that I would somewhat fear. Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but
Well, it's not an answerable question.
yeah, no, I understand. Yeah.
So towards the end, you used the word fair, and so I wonder if I could go back to something you said at the beginning, which is that the talk is really about the political economy of Keynes, and then up to how that might inform today, and in particular the political aspect. I mean, did Keynes really think that the world is essentially economic, or were there other elements, do you think, in his thinking about fairness, justice, redistribution, which seems to be a big part of the problem today, beyond just interests?
Well, you know, I think it's fair to say that Keynes saw that politics had to play a large part in his system. After all, he was an engineer of a lot of these institutions, the post-war institutions, for example, and he blamed block-headed leadership for the failures of the Treaty of Versailles. So, yes. So, the point I was trying to make is that in a lot of circumstances, you get political leaders who are stuck in old systems and can't adapt to new circumstances. I think that's what Keynes was saying about the Paris Peace Conference.
I was actually asking about the people in general, the people who elect the politicians, the sense of fairness and justice in society and how that might evolve over time.
Well, that's a hard one. I mean, one of the things that came out of the 1930s was the idea that governments are responsible for full employment and for the prosperity of their publics. That was not the case in the 19th century. There were depressions and recessions, and governments survived that because the government was not that implicated in the economy as a whole. But that's all different. So you have a mild recession now, and they toss the administration out. So, yeah, I think the public has fairly significant demands on their leaders in that regard. Now, you asked the question about fairness. You mean redistribution?
Well, beyond, I mean, that's one aspect, but even beyond just economic issues, redistribution being a major one, but the one you mentioned also, that the government should protect us against everything,
right?
Storms,
right,
hurricanes.
That's probably a misplaced faith that we've evolved in the modern era. And of course, government constantly wants to reassure us that they're there to protect us, and people are continually amazed when they're not there to stop a hurricane and a terrorist can hit us and so on. So there are certainly limits to what government can do, and we'd be better off if we recognized that. There was a redistributionist aspect in Keynes's economic theory, which was that he thought that these recessions were caused by underconsumption. People hoarded their money or saved it or whatever. And he felt that if you had a wider distribution of income, there would be more spending because, of course, the wealthier someone is, the less likely they are to spend their money. So if you get a broader distribution of income, there's a higher propensity to consume. That was an aspect of Keynes's theory that many Keynesians still hold to. I mean, you could ask the question, what was it? Where did all that money go in the Great Depression? The stock market in, I think, 1929, before it crashed, the New York Stock Exchange was valued at about $90 billion, all the companies on the New York Stock Exchange. That was roughly equal to U.S. GDP in 1929. By 1932, that value had been cut to about 10 or 15% of that total, $10 billion or something like that, because the Dow went from 384 to about 42. And then it never got to that 384 again until 1954, 25 years. But where did that $80 billion go? I wish I knew the answer to that. I think Keynes's argument was that, well, it disappeared because people, because they were insecure, they were hoarding money. And as they took money out of circulation, values collapsed. And as values collapsed, they took more money out of circulation, and values collapsed. So that you had this deflation taking place that no one could catch up with until it hit rock bottom. That would be kind of be the argument. So how do you arrest that kind of spiral once it gets going? What would be called a debt deflation spiral. People are in debt, asset values are falling, they got to sell before they go down further to pay their debts, but every time they sell, the price level goes down, and they have to sell faster, and the price level goes down. You can never catch up with it. Well, his idea was that, well, the government can help to reflate the situation. You can't do much just to get rid of the debt, but you can do something about the deflation, he argued. So I'm not sure that's answering your question about fairness. Obviously, opinion has evolved, and the more governments are capable of doing along that score, people come to the fore to demand it. In the 19th century, people didn't really expect the government to do any of these things, to redistribute income or protect us from hurricanes and that sort of thing. But those part of the Keynesian revolution is a revolution, and those expectations that we impose on the political process.
You give a very sympathetic reading of both Keynes's polemical and then later theoretical work, right? Beginning of this 1914, at the end of this 1914 to 45 period. I wonder if we can play counterfactuals, and if I can invite you to say a few things about a possible sort of alternative path that could have been taken in this period. Now, we know, I mean, James Burnham wrote about in the late 30s, early 40s, that we now really live in a managerial state, not in a Republican, under a Republican form of government, and it seems like this goes very nicely with Keynes's ideas and inventions in economics and political economy. So what were some alternative paths in this? Can we imagine? Can we talk about an alternative path in the when we were crafting the big sort of monetary system, economic system in the West after the defeat of the two Germanys? How could we have designed this thing differently? So maybe it would have.
You mean, Danilo? You mean after World War II? Or
yeah, let's say after World War II. Yeah, I'm trying to like piece it all together. Was there another way?
Well, I mean, you could look at it a different way. I mean, I think I referred to this. If you look at the interwar system, it was chaos. It was one crisis after another. So now fast forward to the period from 1945 to 1970. It's a pretty good period in the West of economic growth and stability and American leadership. And, you know, the welfare states are growing. So when you say, was there an alternative path, the path we got on in 1945 turned out to be a pretty good path. I don't really see a different road that could have gotten us to the same place, because what was necessary was that the United States step forward and assume a role of leadership in the international economy, which is what no one did in 1919. So you know, what the United States did in that period, in this entire period, was, you know, extremely important to the success of the world over this period. So post-war, I think largely we did most things right. I'd like to hear what we might have done differently. I'm sure there were mistakes were made, as they would say, but the Marshall Plan and the IMF and the World Bank and, you know, the dollar decade and all that was very successful. In the end, it even brought down the Soviet Union as we pushed it. Now you could say, and people have argued that Roosevelt blundered in the 30s and made the Depression worse. I think you could argue that he made business conditions worse by, for example, punitive taxes on the wealthy, on a tax on corporations and businessmen, very high corporate tax rate in the 1930s that he imposed, recognition of labor unions in the Wagner Act in 1935 doubled the number of people in unions in just a few years. So yes, I think you could say Roosevelt, you could make that case that Roosevelt blundered there. But in terms of the international economy post-war, you know, I think the verdict of history is that the United States handled that quite well. Yeah.
I just have a follow-up question on efficiency of the economy, and I'm wondering, a lot of companies right now are trying to internationalize in order to improve their efficiency, and I think late Samuel Huntington kind of criticized that view, because we need to kind of balance between nationalizing these firms and internationalizing these firms. And these companies try to internationalize in order to, quote, to make the efficiency better. I'm just wondering what your opinion is on the balance between nationalizing and internationalizing, and what Keynes would say about this as well.
Interesting. Well, I don't have a strong opinion on that. Keynes was thinking mainly of national economies. The idea of a multinational corporation had not yet dawned on him. So he was heavily focused on protecting the British economy and the pound and its role in the international system. So Keynes had not yet gotten to the point where we eventually got in the 70s and 80s and afterwards of these corporations that straddle boundaries and so on. That might be a factor which will also eventually explode the system that we have. Over here.
A history question, and it might have even been inadvertently covered in your talk to some degree. What did Keynes think of, say, Munich in '36, and what did can he class like someone like Churchill, who had a clear vision of Hitler earlier on than most of the leadership in England and America or France? Or
yeah, Keynes criticized the government in England for not rearming earlier. So yes, in that sense, he agreed with Churchill that England had to rearm once Hitler appeared on the scene. Keynes had a run-in with Churchill in 1926 because England went back on the gold standard in 1926, and it was a catastrophe because it meant that wages had to be cut through the British economy. There were general strikes and so on. And within 5 years, they went off the gold standard. Keynes criticized this, and later on, Churchill relied a fair amount on Keynes because he acknowledged he'd been right. in that circumstance. But yeah, he was somewhat with Churchill in that period in the 30s.
Well, we have to stop. It's 2 o'clock, and Jim, we're very grateful for your wonderful analysis.
Oh, great! Thanks very much, and thank you very much.